There's 4 elements, right? Well, actually there's 118 of them, but why bring science into fiction? We're all fans of the 5th element here, so we are just sticking with the 4. Heraldry, picking 2 or more colors and a pattern and sticking it all over the place. That's my plan for this video, to show off some staple heraldry configurations, but then make them fancy with some freehand after. Though to explain what colors I'm picking and why, I have to explain the model first. On the fantasy side of one-page rules this month, it's the start of the Empire faction. To explain what they're about in the shortest hand I can muster, they've designed themselves around the elements their mages use: air, fire, earth, water, that sort of thing. And each one of those has an animal that goes along with them, which you can see clearly on the captains with the boar shoulder and the eagle on their steed. But the infantry here can also have very flat shields, giving us a perfect canvas on which we can paint our own ideas. Well, I like the idea of magical elements, so I've printed out 4 arms with just the flat shields and 1 whole infantry, and I'll use those to create a heraldry for each of the elements. When it comes to the element of earth, I feel like I only have 2 choices for the dual colors, either green and gray or green and brown. Because I know green's involved either way, I'm going to start with that. On my palette I have phthalo green, yellow oxide, and burnt umber. I'll make 2 pools of green, one darker with just the umber and green, and a lighter one with both of those again, but also the yellow oxide. The only reason I mix up 2 colors is because I'm going to do a wet blend between them, but start with a solid base first. For this heraldry, I'm just going to do a horizontal split, so bottom half green and top half the other color. So I just put a solid base of the 2 greens side by side, spanning their area. For the actual wet blend, I'm going to use my flat brush and dip the bristles in the lighter color, then just the tip into the dark and blend it out a bit on my palette. Taking it to the shield, I'll start in the shadows and just move it back and forth to the top of the line. Now I did have a bit of a problem with the paint ripping up, which I fixed later off camera, but it should only take a few coats of this blend to get a nice transition. Just wait until it dries between coats. For my second color, I decided on gray. I'll use white and black to make it of course, but I'm also going to add some of the burnt umber because by adding it to my green, it made it warm. So I want this gray to be warm as well. Once again, making 2 puddles, a light gray and a dark gray. And also once again, I'll start with just doing a few solid bands of paint to give me the base of the gradient as well as the direction for it. And this time, I'll let it dry a little bit longer. Going over it again with the flat brush. This time adding the dark paint to the brush and adding the light gray to the tip. I did it this way because I always find it easier to start on the edges that connect to other parts than the flat line that I made myself. A couple of these layers, letting it dry fully between each, should give me 2 gradients side by side. And if I was doing just a color heraldry, I could leave it like that, or maybe split it into 4s. But instead, I'm going to try some freehand, which I don't do often, so all of this is just experimental. Since I wanted brown in this anyway, that's what I'm going to start with, but quite a light one made from the umber and yellow oxide again. I'll get out my fine detail brush and start by making a small trunk in the middle between the 2 colors. From there, I'll make a few large lines that squiggle off in every direction, and once those are in, start to add thinner branching squiggles. This was looking a little dark overall, so I lightened the paint with more yellow oxide and started to give it a little highlight where things forked and along the trunk of the freehand tree. One last thing to do, but before I do it, so I don't start ripping up the paint with a technique, I'm going to put on a good layer of my matte varnish, just so there's a barrier between the work so far and a brush. I got out some fresh yellow and green for this because I want them thick, like from the tube thick, and use this really weird textured dry brush from GW. I mix them by dabbing the brush down, and then take that whole system of dabbing the brush down to the shield to do the exact same thing. If you don't have a brush like this, a proper stippling would work too. I just wanted to try it this way. And lastly, because I found these leaves too uniform of a color, I added some more yellow to the mix and just made a few stipples around the surface of the tree branches to give some color difference. So to evaluate, I like green and warm gray as an earth theme. Makes me think of moss and rock. But in this case, in hindsight, I might have switched the lightness of the ground green with the leaves green so that the roots showed up better and the tree had some overall lightness. When I think air, I think lightning. And when I think lightning, I think blue and purple. Blue and purple, though, are really close on the color wheel, so I think I'm going to have to go light with them to make sure that the difference is seen. So just a dioxazine purple and a phthalo blue, with an adequate amount of white to get them started. Since I did the earth shield horizontally, I'm going to do this one vertically, though in the same fashion as the last one, starting with adding bands to outline where the gradient is going to go, but this time all at once. So the light blue and the purple up against each other in the middle, and the raw purple and blue over the black primer towards the edges. Then just like the other one, let it dry completely, and then use my flat brush, filling it with the light color and dabbing the tip into the dark color, because I'll be putting that thick drop of paint into the edge of the rim and whisking back and forth to spread it out on the way out to the middle. Now the reason I did the gradient with the light paints in the middle was a setup for the freehand this time around, which of course is going to be a lightning bolt. I start with a pale mix of the blue and purple for an in-between of my two colors, and lots of white to make it light. Then using a thick brush, I'll draw the core. Start from the tip top, zigzag a few lines out, culminating in the bottom center. Where they zig, I'll add an extended zag to make it start to look like lightning. I'll now grab a thinner brush and then start adding extra forks to the branches I just created. Something thinner that ends in a thin line, but since these are small, I can add some to the main body too, and it'll just seem like a zag that didn't quite make it. With the core in place, I need a halo, and for that I'm going to use my airbrush and add some more color to light the core color I used so it's not as bright, but still vibrant. I'll add a bit of it to a bunch of medium in my airbrush. Then I'll carefully and lightly start to airbrush it around the lightning bolts, giving it a soft glow around it, mostly aiming for the middle of the core. Then for the last step, with a bunch more white and just a bit of the color still, I'll use my really fine brush again. What I want to do here is add the hot point to the core by adding a thin line in the middle of it. This is where the bolt would burn the brightest. For my overview on this one, I think it has the easiest freehand so far. I know all of those steps made it look like a bit much, but they were actually quite fast to do, so if I were to do a unit's shields, I don't think this one would actually be all that bad time-wise. When thinking water, I also think blue, but since I have blue and purple already, I need to shift my other color the other way and go with aqua instead. So the same blue as the lightning, but now with green mixed with the blue for a turquoise instead of purple, and the same white to lighten it all up. Another classic for heraldry is the four corners checkerboarded, and since I'm not going to make gradients this time, this will just be the base layers. Finding a middle in the shield is probably the hardest part, so that's why I'm doing a couple of lines from where I approximate the middles to be, and make my center where they cross. Will this be perfect? No, but since I'm not doing a gradient this time, with subsequent fill-in layers, I can refine that position if I think it's too high or too low, going over the lines as needed until I feel it's as close to the center as my hands can get it. This is what we usually think when we see heraldry. Some icons and text might complete it, or even just some battle damage. But seeing as how the theme was water, I thought maybe waves or something sea foamy. Well, I don't think I have the freehand skills for that, so my next option was a whirlpool. Using medium, white, and a bit of each color, I got a transparent mix. Starting from the middle, I make a whirl, keeping the brush moving in one flowing motion, trying to get at least a few go-arounds before hitting an edge. I kept the paint transparent just in case I needed to cover this up and try again. But this looked alright, so I went a few more passes over it to make it a solid line. To refine a bit more, I'm going to start having the colors bleed into each other's sections. so have a point go out to the edge and then get wider as it gets back to its own quarter. I can't say for sure why I started doing it this way, but once I did the first one, I just had to keep going from there. And eventually my quarters turned into whorls as well. So I guess they're not exactly quarters anymore, but I still get the sense that they are. So in the end, I quite like this design, though a bit harder to do. The only thing I'm not sure on is how to give it more depth, as without the gradient, it's quite flat. So some battle damage or airbrush shadows around the edges could fix that. When I think of fire, I think red and yellow. But those also make me think of hot dogs and hamburgers. So I can't just do two colors. I'll have to include orange as well. Red, orange, and yellow though, that's going to be a nightmare to paint over black. So instead, I'm going to start with a light gray background for my shield. Light gray because it'll cover the black easier, but also still have enough white particles to reflect through the red and yellow. Red and yellow being primary colors means there's no mixing needed to get them. They're always going to be the nicest straight from the bottle, tube, or pot. But that means they can also be lazily used to get my orange too. While I do have pure pigment oranges, I figure a mix between the red and yellow will give me my best matching orange to go with the fire they represent. Because I have 3 colors instead of 2, the best way to get my heraldry background is to do a tri-split, where 2 of the colors are split, but then one takes up the full area, top or bottom. I'm going to go with yellow on the bottom and the red and orange splitting the top. Again, mostly I don't want symmetry between the red and yellow, otherwise it'll make it look like ketchup and mustard. When it comes to doing the outline, I err on the side of going out of bounds with the yellow and being really dang careful with the orange and red, because orange and red will easily cover the yellow, but trying to get the yellow back if I go outside the lines is going to be a lot of hassle. So 3-color heraldries are possible by just letting one color take over more than the others. As far as how I want to add freehand to this one, the obvious answer is flames. I don't want to go with the obvious answer though, so I'm going to go with an igneous theme instead, making a dark obsidian from a black, purple, and a brown. Now for the scary part, because any mess ups are going to be hard to fix, but I'm going to put one stone in the center to hide that imperfect midpoint between all the colors, trying to make it as non-circular as I can with straight lines, but not a pure hexagon either, and then add some bigger ones below it in the yellow, leaving lots of space between them. Then start to fill in stone all over, but make them smaller the more into the red and orange I get, so it's like they're coming up from the bottom of the shield. I'll add a tiny amount of white to the base mix because I don't want to offset the color that much, but still get a semblance of a highlight on the rocks. So just starting from the center, I'll draw fading lines out to each of the pointed edges of the stone, which should make each one seem more crystallized in structure. To really solidify that glass-like obsidian, I'm just going to add some more white to the last mix and start to pick out some of the flat, sharp edges along the tops of the formations. This should just give them that bit of a sharp edge highlight and light direction. So I'm really happy with how the fire element turned out, and while not a dazzling display of flames, which seems really difficult to do, the obsidian is impressive in its own right and much simpler to path out. I'm not that great with freehand. It's something I've not practiced a lot, and I'm not much of a 2D artist. But that's what's good about heraldry. At its core, it's just some straight lines and vibrant colors. And of course, you can use those colors elsewhere on the model to keep the theme going. You don't need to have anything fancy in the colors on the shield if it's just matching the colors in the tabards and clothes. Maybe you might think of different colors when it comes to different elements. So there's still lots of room to experiment and play with these flat shields. This month on my Patreon, I've got a unique figure for everyone to get a hold of and follow along with painting. A crab trucker by Manuel Herrera. A silly little concept that seemed quite fun to the both of us. Sea creatures and freight trucks aren't something often seen smashed together, but we've done it here. It also comes with an exclusive painting video that goes with it that explains in detail how I painted the stripes on his shirt, so get the pre-supported STL and video in the Expedition tier on my Patreon at patreon.com/paintmanjourneying. Find the link in the description. Please subscribe if you like this video, and check the link in the description to my Discord where I talk all sorts of nonsense about miniatures painting, provide critique on paint jobs, and occasionally stream.